Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Learning Journey 3. It's the last part of the series of nonprofit discussions before we have an October 4th conference. So block your calendars if you're interested to attend that face-to-face conference. The theme for this year is solutions that help us help one another. And by that, we mean mutual aid and contributing to the commons. Basically, the question is, what if communities can help one another, engage in peer-to-peer support rather than purchase external expert professional help from the market or receive services administered by the state? So that kind of frames the whole series of conversations. And so we started off by talking about community currencies and times. What if we could have forms of currency or systems that allowed people to meet their unmet needs with untapped capacities. We also had a series of conversations about worker-owned and platform cooperatives. What if workers were co-owners of the firms that they worked in, and these are typically low-wage workers? Will it improve social mobility and economic inclusion? And today we are talking about learning. Is there a way that communities can learn from one another and not rely on experts or professionals? So basically the inquiry is, what if we could unlock the learning capacities and capabilities of communities so they can teach and learn from one another? And one of the reasons why we started this is because I was inspired by a nonprofit organization in Baltimore, and we're visiting Baltimore at the end of August, bringing a couple of practitioners along there. At one of the organizations we're visiting is called the Baltimore Algebra Project. And what they do, it's really interesting because these are African American youth and they come from impoverished backgrounds, and the organization brings in grants and education money, and they pay the wages of slightly older youth so that they can teach slightly younger youth math and science. And in a way, the youth would have gone out flipping burgers, right? But because of this, they're allowed to come back and teach their own and contribute to their own communities. And when I heard about this, something stirred inside me. I thought this was great, the youth would be helping each other. And when you teach, it also solidifies your own foundations in it. And it's just such a wonderful, elegant model. And then I think to our own local system, which is if you are well off and you want to get ahead, you go to all these enrichment or tuition centers and you can pay for it. If you cannot pay for it, then there are nonprofits that help you out. And in fact, just the other day, I have a 6-year-old and 3-year-old, and me and my wife were walking past a very nice enrichment center, tuition center. And the founder had put up all these accolades and credentials displayed on the storefront, the awards she had won, and all the nice testimonials from the kids who said they did so well in school. And so my wife turned to me and said, "What do you think about this?" And I said, "Well, clearly she wants to earn your money." And so it stirred me in a different direction, I felt. Prior to this, we had a panel discussion on peer-to-peer learning as well, and we invited Peer-to-Peer University. They are an American nonprofit. And what they do is that they form learning circles. Largely, they work with libraries, but also some nonprofits. And what they do is they provide some facilitation. So if adults want to come together and use free educational resources online, whether it's course materials, formal course materials, or textbooks, etc., the groups will meet once a week for a period of months, and they will just learn. And these are typically adult learners. As I'm reading, again, our guest speakers today, they are bio, I realized that they are also part of Kubrio.com, and what they do is that they kind of do learning pods or learning circles for youth. So that's kind of interesting. And so back to our speakers, when I watched the film that they made called School Circle, something stirred in me again. And so they will tell you a bit about the documentary they made about democratic schools in Netherlands. And so basically today, Charlie Shred and Marian Osorio will talk to us about two things. One is democratic schools and one is sociocracy. So what are democratic schools? Charlie and Marian can tell you more about it, but it basically involves children deciding their own curriculum in schools which are relatively free. And so I'm imagining the audience here today very practical minded, and probably some of you are tiger moms. You might have certain opinions about this, whether this will work in a Singapore context, right? How can you let kids decide what to do, whether they learn, they just end up playing video games all day, things like that. But I want you to, whatever your views of democratic schools or democratic education, consider the underlying principles that might be valuable here. Self-directed learning, peer-to-peer or collaborative learning. When I watched the film, what struck me, and so we had a film screening. The film screening was organized by A Good Space and was done at the projector at Beach Road, and was nice because people don't go out to watch a show in the dark together with many strangers anymore. It's all Netflix. So it was nice. It was nice because it felt like a religious experience, because you watched it, you get goosebumps, especially because it was powerful to me. I get easily stirred. What was immediately evident to me was that these kids in these small schools, they were not in competition with one another. My experience of school is that it's all a competition. Immediately you are evaluated and sorted in terms of how well you did academically, and your friends were your competitors. They were not people that you try to learn from or teach. You simply had just to get ahead. But in these schools, there was a sense that you were in the same boat. And there's a small community of learners. And in fact, the teachers were sometimes just co-learners trying to figure things out together with you. There was a lot of freedom, and not freedom in the way that you think that you could simply do anything. What struck me from the film was that freedom is not what simply, it's not about being able to do what you want. Freedom is, in these schools, you'd be surprised that there are so many rules and regulations, but these rules and regulations are co-created by the students as well as the teachers and even the parents. So that's what freedom means in this context, that you have an ability to contribute to the rule making. And also, I mean, if I just look at the kids, it just seems like they're learning how to participate in a democracy, and I just kind of feel like, well, that's what life should be like. So that's the democratic school part of it. The other part of it is the sociocracy part of it. And it's a kind of decentralized organization that distributes decision making. And Charlie and Marian can explain more. But to me, it's what's interesting to me is that this is a kind of truly social innovation. When we think about social innovation, we think about some kind of tech applied to a social issue, like seniors with dementia playing some iPad games in order to improve their cognition. But this is innovating on the sociality itself, how people organize themselves, come together, make decisions collectively. How do you organize rounds, and so it affects the kind of feeling of being in a group and relating to that group. And so it's quite elegant in the sense that it allows everyone's views to matter, but yet it's efficient enough so that you don't get stuck trying to get some consensus. So to me, is really quite interesting, and perhaps if you're organizing communities or in a nonprofit organization, that this kind of mode of organizing could be of interest to you as well, because often it is the administrator or the convener or the leader of the community that is the bottleneck. If you don't do something, then nothing happens. And this is a different paradigm. And so I guess it's a kind of a long way to say that many of the things that we've introduced in this conference challenges our existing paradigms. And I think, for me at least, getting acquainted with democratic education has challenged what I think about learning, because learning extends beyond schools, but our paradigm of learning kind of gets fixed on the school, which is the institution. But schools have, to me, become more like people processing institutions, whereby people are graded and sorted and deployed into industry. But things could be so much different, I hope that, when my kids grow up, they see their friends in school and they rejoice that their friends are so clever because they can learn from them, rather than get dismayed or disappointed that their friends are so clever and therefore their friends will do better than them. The other paradigm is that I suppose that organizations can be imagined differently, of how we think we can come together to make collective decisions. But largely also, I think the paradigm of life itself, it can be imagined differently. If we talk about the commons and contributing to the commonwealth, we see mostly our whole life as a race, and so the point is getting ahead. But I guess the counter logic of contributing to the commonly shared wealth is that maybe the dominating metaphor should not be life as a race and to get ahead, but perhaps life is a puzzle, and the whole point or goal is to figure out how we fit in with one another. And so I think Charlie and Marianne has pointed to a really important part about how we can learn together. And so without further ado, can I invite Charlie and Marianne to speak with us?
Hey, hi Justin, hi everyone. So yeah, thank you so much for this invitation to talk today. It's a great honor. And yeah, we'd like to give a talk. We have some slides. We'll give about a 1-hour talk. And then after this talk, we'll have time for conversation and question and answers. And yeah, hopefully it'll be a really rich experience. So we'd just like to share our screen. Yeah. So yeah, as Justin said, we're going to be talking about democratic education and sociocracy today. So that's going to be the theme of our talk. And yeah, my name is Charlie Shred, and this is Marianne Osorio. And we are the co-creators of the Wandering School project, as well as the producers of the School Circles film. We're also consultants and trainers in sociocracy. So we give courses to schools and educators to implement sociocracy into their setting. And yeah, so let's take you through some of our story and dive into a bit of this context.
Lovely. So I'm going to start introducing a bit our project. So Wandering School, we call it as a research project through which we investigate and support liberating education, as we call. I'm going to say something more about liberating education in a bit. And as Charlie said, through Wandering School, we offer training. We also make videos, films, which are usually case studies of different educational practices. We give talks, and we offer consulting as well to schools and educational projects. So here are some pictures of our journey. The first one is in Portugal. We are having a conversation with the families about what's the point of school. The second picture is us in India. We had visited the Children's Parliament there, and we were facilitating a sociocracy workshop. And the third picture is us interviewing a child as well about what's the point of school. So here are some examples of what we've been doing. So I am an educator and biologist from Brazil. I used to be a science teacher in a state school in Brazil. And I also used to facilitate democratic decision-making in classroom meetings with my students. So that's how my journey started. And Charlie is a filmmaker from the UK. And our paths crossed when I went to the UK to do a master research. And I was investigating democratic schools in Brazil. And I invited Charlie to come with me and document these schools. So we were there together doing interviews, filming, and we realized that filmmaking and research and education were a good combination. So we started doing that in 2015. And since then, we've visited more than 40 schools around the world, most of them democratic schools. As you can see in the map, a big chunk of them are in Europe and also in Brazil. In Asia, we've only been to India, where we visited the Children's Parliament. And yeah, that's that's it. That's a bit about our journey, I would say. And what are we calling liberating education? Well, this term is coined by Paulo Freire. He's a Brazilian educator, a big inspiration for us. And he says that no one teaches another, nor is anyone self-taught. People teach each other, mediated by the world. So I think this is a really good quote for our conference today. And basically, Paulo Freire says that dialogue should be at the core of the educational process. So neither should the teachers be the center of the educational process, neither should the students be the center, but actually dialogue and learning itself. So in my master research, I investigated the principles of liberating education, and I identified 4 main principles. The first one is autonomy. So this is the freedom itself, and the way that Paulo Freire describes freedom is a collective freedom. So we only free when the other one is free as well. So instead of saying that my freedom ends where the other person's freedom starts, we say that my freedom only starts where the freedom of the other starts as well. So we can only be free together. And of course, he talks about the ability to manage your own time, to be, an autonomous being that is able to learn and find the resources and develop yourself. And then dialogue, as I said, is at the core of the process. So we name the world together. We identify core themes to learn together, and the teacher is the one encouraging this dialogue and making the questions. And then the third pillar he calls problematization, which is about critical thinking and questioning reality and recognizing that we live in limit situations such as inequality or poverty. And these are sources, these are the core for us to investigate and learn together. So we get to identify limit situations, and from that point we start dialogue and we start learning together and doing projects and interventions. And that takes us to the 4th principle, which is engagement with the world. And that's about diving into reality, once more facing the contradictions, facing the challenges, and together transforming the world, transforming the reality that we live in. So that's what we call liberating education. This picture is the Politeia Democratic School in Brazil. They were participating in the protests here. That was in 2015. It was a protest against the outsourcing of labor, which was taking many steps back in the workers' rights and workers' movement. So the kids and the 6-year-old were there making signs and protesting with the teachers. So there was a great example of engagement with the world. If you're curious to read more about that, here's my master research. It's available for free on our website as well. And what we realize is that a good place to find a liberating education is in democratic schools, because democratic schools, they seem to have put into practice these 4 principles, or at least most of them, such as autonomy, dialogue, the problematization and engagement with the world. Sometimes not every democratic school goes that far, but autonomy and dialogue, yes. So yeah, Charlie's gonna show you a few examples of democratic schools. And at the end of our presentation, we're also gonna show you a map with many democratic schools for you to have an idea how big this movement is.
Yeah, so this is just a very brief overview of a bit of sort of history and examples of some democratic schools from around the world. So this very first one in the top left, as far as we understand, it's probably the first attempt at a democratic school. So this was founded by John Dewey, the famous philosopher and educationist. And this was the laboratory school. And this was probably the first example of trying to involve the children in co-creating a curriculum and involving them in some form of decision-making that affects how the school is shaped. The next example is Escola Moderna, which was founded in Spain. And this one has been a great influence for a lot of the Latin-speaking world, such as Spain, Portugal, and here in Brazil. And the next one, Summerhill, is probably the most famous democratic school. A lot of people consider it the oldest surviving or currently existing democratic school. It was founded in the UK by A.S. Neal, who was kind of an anarchist. And yeah, that has a few films about it. You can find quite a lot about it online. And the next one I want to talk a bit about, because this is a big inspiration for the schools that we visited and filmed. So De Werkplaats School, which was founded in the Netherlands, was actually the kind of the base for the films in the school circles film. So this was a great example of a democratic school that also started to implement sociocracy. So this was the first attempt at sociocracy in the world. And the next example is Sudbury Valley. So this one has a huge influence on a lot of alternative and democratic education around the world. So they're the pioneers of what can be called natural learning or unschooling or free schools. So they're really kind of one of the first sort of free schools that have influenced loads of democratic schools around the world. And the next one, Escola de Ponte, which is in Portugal. This one took influence from Escola Moderna and has been a really big reference for schools in Latin-speaking countries, especially in Portugal and South America. And one of the co-founders, or the Jose Pacheco, one of the guys that kind of helped transition this to more of a democratic school, took many of these ideas to learning communities and democratic schools, especially here in Brazil. So what's interesting about that is actually a state school. So it's one of the few state schools around the world that is democratic. So they involve all the kids in making decisions for the school. It's a little bit sad that the state school restrictions have started to limit what they're actually capable of doing, but that's a whole other story. The next example is Hadera School in Israel, and this has been a really influential school in the last 30 years. So when they were founded, they also started the International Democratic Education Conference and Network. So this has been a conference to bring democratic schools from around the world together and to try and really expand the democratic school movement. And Hadera School was the first school that actually put the word democratic in the name of the school. So it's Hadera Democratic School. And Yaakov Hecht, one of the co-founders, he wrote a book called Democratic Education. And it's a very influential book in the world of democratic schools. And another key point about Hadera is that it's been the source of a growing movement of state schools in Israel. So there's now lots of democratic state schools in Israel, and they're trying to expand this out into other countries as a model of creating state-run democratic schooling. And one more thing from there is they're trying to expand beyond the school walls to create democratic cities or educational cities. And so this is really the interesting point of creating this sort of pluralistic dialogue, learning and engaging with the world to really network a whole city together with the democratic schools as kind of key nodes in that network. The last example is Sands School, which also helped to create the Democratic Education Network with Hadera, and they were founded in the same year. And they're a really interesting reference because they were founded by a group of teenagers and teachers who came out of a very alternative school, Dartington Hall School, that was closed down as it was considered too controversial. And they came together with the kids and said, how are we going to make a brand new school from scratch? So from the very beginning, the teachers and the students shaped the school from the beginning. And one last comment is that all of these schools are very diverse. So you have private schools, state schools, some are kind of elitist, some are much less so. So you get this really diversity of pedagogy and how they engage the kids as well. And they're all democratic schools.
Yeah, I just want to say that the majority of democratic schools worldwide are actually private. So it's rare to find a state democratic school, but Escola da Ponte, it's one of them, and Hadera School is another one. Also, Sudbury Valley ended up influencing a lot of democratic schools, and then sometimes people think that democratic schools look like Sudbury Valley, but it's not true. There are other types of pedagogies and educational approaches in democratic schools as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. For example, Escola da Ponte is very different from Sudbury model.
Very different.
So what defines democratic education then, if they're so diverse? And we identify two main principles. The first one is the democratic governance itself. So this is practiced by having school meetings with the students and staff. And so the students participate actively in the democratic process and decision-making process of the school. So they are involved in making the rules and the agreements of the school. They're involved in mediating conflicts. So here is an example, a picture of a school meeting, also in Politeia School here in Brazil. And soon we're going to show you a video from our film with a school meeting in process, so you can have an idea how it looks like.
Yeah, just to relate what Justin said at the beginning, how the democratic schools create their own rules. So this is where they create the rules in the meetings with the kids.
And the second principle that defines democratic education is the students' autonomy in their own learning process. And this can have many degrees and can also be practiced in many different ways. So the first principle is related to the governance, and the second principle is related to the pedagogy. But there's no single pedagogy in a democratic school. So a few examples of how we can put into practice this autonomy principle. It's through self-directed education. So this is a big term also used in democratic education, which basically means that the students have autonomy to decide when and what and how they want to learn. It's also a broad term. Then we can have project-based learning. So Escola da Ponte and the schools here in Brazil, a lot of democratic schools, they actually follow project-based learning, as long as the student is the one deciding the theme of the project. So it's not the teacher that comes with the theme. No, it's the student based on their own interests. And then the tutor helps the student to develop their project. Then we can also have study guides. In this case, you might have a more fixed curriculum, but the students decide the order that they want to follow that curriculum and when and where in the school. So they might have the guide on their hands, but they still have the autonomy to decide how and when they want to dive into that guide. And then we can have study groups mediated by students or by adults. And also the theme of the study groups is defined by the students themselves. And we can also have self-evaluation. So there's another way of evaluating, assessing the knowledge that was built through the process. So these are a few examples of tools and approaches to develop the students' autonomy. And then there is a third principle, which is a bonus and extra, principle, which is a curriculum based on human rights. And Yaakov Hatch from Israel is the one who brings this in. And ideally, yes, we would love to see democratic schools with a curriculum based on human rights. It's also more related to Paulus Freire approach on problematization and engagement with the world. But the truth is that most democratic schools, they actually don't put that into practice, at least from our observations. So the two first principles are really the defining ones of democratic schools. And in our presentation today, we're going to focus in the governance. So we're not going to get into the pedagogy or the curriculum much. We're going to focus on the democratic governance and more specifically sociocracy as a form of decision making. So this is our film, School Circles, that Justin mentioned as well. And the film is a documentary about 6 democratic schools in the Netherlands that practice sociocracy. We're going to tell a bit more about the history of sociocracy, what it is, the principles, so we're going to get there. And our motivation to do this film, well, basically, when we visited many democratic schools, all of them were using majority rule decision-making, which is the form of governance that we are more used to. So we ask people to raise their hands, to vote against or forward, and then we count the votes, and the majority wins. So we saw that in every school that we visited, and we started to notice a few challenges with majority rule. What a funny thing was that even also when I was in the state school practicing decision-making with the kids, every time we had a conflict and we asked them to come out with a solution, they would come out with punishments because they were so used to that. That's the culture of the school, that's the culture of the families. So if we had to vote, the majority would vote for harsh punishments. And I thought that was really weird. And then when we visited some democratic schools, we noticed the same pattern, and including one of the big democratic schools we visited, the kids came out with the rule of paying fines. So they were paying with their pocket money. If they disrespected the rules, they would have to pay the fines. And we thought this is so odd because we are recreating the world that we see outside, that we're so critical of. So is there an alternative? Is there another way of decision making that is more inclusive, that overcomes this punitive justice and culture of punishments? Also, we noticed that majority rule often generates the exclusion of minorities, segregation, polarization, competition. So we started to wonder, could there be another way of decision making that overcomes these challenges? And then it was in 2015 that we got to know sociocracy in the UK. And since then we start thinking, are there any sociocratic schools in the world? And because sociocracy as a method of governance was developed in the Netherlands, we thought, let's start searching in the Netherlands. And we found around 12 democratic schools there that use sociocracy. And we managed to film 6 of them. So this is what the film is about. If you're curious, here's the website, so you can watch in your own time. It's now available on YouTube as well.
We're going to show a very short clip from the film as well soon. So you'll see how it works.
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe just a little bit on democracy and sociocracy. What's the relation? What's the similarity and difference? Well, if we just look at the word democracy, can break it down into demos, which means people, and kratos, which means power. So literally it means power of the people or power to the people. And then sociocracy comes from socius, which means like companions or peers or colleagues. So this means like power of the companions or power of the friends. And we say this because in sociocracy, break it down into small groups. So we get to know each other in smaller circles. So we become companions as opposed to a big populace, a big stage like the demos. And another way of looking at democracy and sociocracy is that democracy is commonly considered the majority rule, or that's how you make the final decision. You do the vote, yes and no, and you count the votes. If it's any more than 51%, then the yes or the no's win. And sociocracy, you make your decision based on consent of all the members. And if we look at the two circles, the bubbles here, so when you look at democracy as majority rule and sociocracy as consent, you can say that they're kind of two different systems, but with a bit of overlap. So sociocracy is over here, democracy is over here, and they're kind of related, but kind of different. But the image that we subscribe to is more like this. So democracy is the larger bubble here, and sociocracy is inside. And we say that because the ultimate goal or the aim of democracy is to put more power in the hands of the people, to redistribute power. So as opposed to an authoritarian decision-making, we're trying to spread out the power. And sociocracy is a tool to achieve this. So it's a specific methodology to help us redistribute power in an effective way.
Yes, so sometimes sociocracy is also called deeper democracy, just to also honor the word democracy, because we know that so in so many countries, they're still living in an authoritarian regime. Democracy is the aim, democracy is the goal, and is already a big achievement. So we don't want to say, oh, forget democracy, we have something better called sociocracy. No, that's not the approach, because sociocracy is just one way to get to a democratic system.
Yeah.
And we believe to be an inclusive way to do it. So what about sociocracy in education then? So as I said before, we have, we like to see these two systems. One is the pedagogy and the other one is the governance. So these are two pillars in any school and educational project. We also have the curriculum, but I'm going to focus here on pedagogy and governance. Pedagogy is how we learn, how we teach and learn in the school. So there is a book by a Brazilian author called Mizukami, and she defines these 5 pedagogical approaches. The first one is traditional, the second is behaviorist, which are usually combined to traditional. And then we have constructivist, humanist, and social cultural. Most democratic schools, they are humanist schools. The liberating education approach from Paulo Freire is social cultural, so there's a bit of a difference there. And then this last 3, they're usually considered the non-traditional schools, non-traditional education. So we can have critical pedagogy from Paulo Freire, we can have Waldorf schools, Montessori schools, Reggio Emilia, Sudbury Valley, modern school. So there are a few different pedagogical approaches here. And why we are bringing this now? Because any pedagogical approach, even a traditional approach, okay, can be practiced with a democratic governance. So we can still have a democratic governance or sociocracy as a way of decision-making, but have a traditional pedagogy. For example, the state school that I worked in, we had a school circle, we had school meetings with parents, teachers, students participating, but the school was very traditional in their pedagogy. And then we have the governance itself, which can be authoritarian. Most traditional schools have an authoritarian governance, or can be democratic. And then when we have a democratic governance, we can have majority rule, which is the majority of the cases. We can have consensus, which is diverse. Consensus and consent, or consensus and sociocracy, they have an overlap. They can be very similar, but sometimes consensus can mean common agreement. So everyone has to positively agree with the same thing. and consent means no objections. So instead of trying to get to an agreement of everyone, we just try to get to a place of no objections. So it can be a bit different. And then sociocracy, it's about getting the consent or no objections from the group. And that's the focus of our talk today. So just to say that we already found sociocratic schools, there are also Waldorf schools, sociocratic schools, there are Montessori schools. So not even every sociocratic school is a democratic school. That's quite interesting, because sometimes sociocracy can be practiced with the staff, but not with the students. So they are sociocratic schools, but not democratic schools. So it's a bit of a confusion there. Just want to clarify that as well.
Yeah, so where did sociocracy come from? Well, the first use of the word was by Auguste Comte, who is the French philosopher and one of the first sociologists. Some say that he coined the term sociology as well, but that's debatable. So he came up with this idea, this philosophy of sociocracy back in the 1850s. And the original thought was, how can we bring more of a scientific or sociological mindset into the democratic system? So he was trying to think about ways of bringing in this kind of knowledge and awareness of how society works to make more informed decisions. And sometime later, there was this couple, Kees Boeke and Betty Cadbury, and they were living in the Netherlands. And they took some of these ideas from Auguste Comte and Lester Ward, who was an American philosopher who developed some of Comte's ideas. And Kees Boeke and Betty Cadbury created a school, the Werkplaats School, the one that we mentioned earlier. So they had the first attempt to put sociocracy into practice. And what they did is they took some of these ideas and they combined them with their Quaker practice. So they were practicing Quakers, and they were also practicing peace activists. So they took some of the practices of listening in silence and waiting for things to emerge in a group and making consensus decisions together. And this school began to grow, and by the time they reached the Second World War, it became quite an influential school as an activist school, hiding Jewish people. So there was actually a whole community keeping a Jewish community safe and being a resistance against the Nazi occupation in the Netherlands. And one of the students during the Second World War, during this time, was Gerard Endenberg. And if anyone's seen our film, you might recognize his face down there. He's what's considered the sort of founder of the modern sociocratic method. And we interviewed him extensively for our movie. And what he did was he took a lot of the influence from the practice in his school, and he tried to adapt it with some engineering ideas, such as cybernetics, to apply to his business. He had an engineering company that he inherited from his parents. So he was thinking of things like feedback loops and redistribution of power, and he developed 4 fundamental principles for the sociocratic method. And this is what we use today as the basis of sociocracy, which can now be applied to any type of organization, whether it's a school or a business or whatever. So yeah, what are the 4 principles that he developed? Well, the first one is consent. And Mari mentioned this briefly, but it essentially means no objections. So when a group has no more objections to a proposal, then the decision is made in the simplest sense. And then the circle is the other fundamental building block. So it's simply a group of people who have a shared aim and a domain, and they use rounds. So each person gets a chance to speak, and they make their decisions based on consent. So it's made up of small sub-circles. So that's how we distribute the organization and redistribute the power. And then how do we get people into roles. So we use the Sociocratic election or selection. So we call it an open election of roles using consent. And it's open because we don't do like a secret ballot like we often do in democratic elections. You speak openly about the people that you nominated and give the reasons why, and then everybody has to give their consent at the end. And then the last one is called the double link. So we have these circles and we've elected people into roles, and a couple of those roles link circles together. So this creates a fractal pattern. So we can link as many of these circles together to make a large complex organizational structure or a very small concise structure with just a few circles. So this helps to create feedback and communication between the circles. So it makes it very flexible and expandable.
I just want to say that thanks to the double link principle, we can also have sociocracy in a nation or in a country. So the example that we mentioned before of the children's parliament, is the case. So they have like a small circle in the neighborhood, for example, and then they elect 2 representatives who go up in the system, and then they go, for example, to the municipal level, and then they elect 2 more people to go to the state level, and then to the national level. So you can actually have a whole country organized sociocratically as well. And the decisions are made through consent of everyone in the circle. So that's how it could work.
Yeah, so just a little bit more about consent. So we like to use this diagram here. So we have the heart in the middle, and the heart represents our preference, what we really want to happen. And then just outside of this heart, this preference zone, is a zone of tolerance. And we like to use this phrase, good enough for now, safe enough to try. And we say this because a consent decision is not necessarily your preference. It could be your preference, but it might not be. Maybe you can stretch a little bit, stretch out. Maybe you can tolerate it, and that's okay. You're not really actively against it, but you can consent with it. And then if it's beyond this zone of tolerance, if you feel like something is just not right, it's not working, then you have your zone of objection. So then you give your objection. And the word objection in Dutch, the word bezwaar, has a connotation of feeling heavy. So it's kind of a corporal feeling, something you feel in your body. So it has this kind of like this heaviness or this tension. So we're trying to get to this intelligence of feeling our own body and our own feelings as well, to know when we have an objection, when we can be okay with something. And we put these wavy lines. It's not a perfect circle because ultimately it's not a perfect science. We are human beings and we have to feel and try and understand where is our point of tolerance, where is our preference, and where is our objection. We're not robots. So on some day, maybe we're not feeling as tolerant as another day. And that's okay. That's part of the process. It's a continual learning process. So yeah, that's the idea of consent. And yeah, just to clarify, so consent is these 2 areas, the preference and the tolerance.
Yeah, the tolerance area can also be called the stretch zone, if you prefer. The word tolerance sometimes is not very easy to digest.
So yeah, with these ideas in mind, we just want to show a quick clip from our film. We know some of you have already seen it before, and for those who haven't, then I hope you enjoy. It's just a short clip showing a consent decision with some children in a school called the Valley PO. So yeah, should we play it?
Yeah, they are deciding on having a candy floss machine in their party, just to give you a bit of context. I'm going to put English subtitles just to make sure. this video is also on YouTube if you want to watch later.
€60. De suikerspinmachine is €60, dus met alle dingen die je nodig hebt. Dus het is nu de vraag, willen we €60 besteden aan een suikerspinmachine of niet?
Ik vind het te duur en het is overbodig omdat er al superveel hapjes zijn. Maar ik vind het wel lekker, een suikerspinmachine, maar er zijn wel genoeg hapjes, maar het is wel lekker als toetje.
When you're in a circle, you can give your consent, yes or no. Consent or not consent.
Consent. Consent. Niet consent. Niet consent.
4 kinderen zeggen niet consent. Is er een manier waarop zij het voorstel kunnen aanpassen?
Hoe meer, hoe beter.
Dus zodat er wel een suikerspinmachine komt, maar dat jij er wel mee tevreden kan zijn.
Ik vind dat een heel goed idee eigenlijk wat Ida nu zegt. Dus dat we gewoon in de mail zetten, niet te veel zoete hapjes.
Ja.
Mogen wel een paar, maar niet dat de helft zoete hapjes zijn. En wat misschien ook nog één ding is, iedereen krijgt er één, maar één suikerspin. Niet dat kinderen constant terugkomen. Zo van
1 of 2, als je er 2 moet, dan wel een
één.
Dus je voorstel is 1 suikerspin en een meel.
Oké, en dan zou jij consent kunnen vragen. Goed, volgende. Boy, kun jij met deze aanpassing consent gaan op het voorstel?
Ja.
Super, nou hebben we die. Lieve is de volgende. Lieve, kun jij consent gaan met het voorstel?
Consent.
En dan naar Zoe.
Ja, ik vind het gewoon overbodig. Ten eerste omdat voor die €60 kun je ook, weet ik veel, ik weet niet zeker of dat kan, dag een suikerspinmachine te doen en dat je daar ook nog voor moet betalen. Dat vind ik gewoon overbodig.
Met die suikerspinmachine, ik heb gezorgd dat we 200 suikerspinnen eruit kunnen krijgen. Daarom, hoe zeg je dat, dacht ik, nou als we daar gewoon vragen 50% voor bijvoorbeeld, dan heb je sowieso al €100 terugverdiend. Als er 200 opgaan.
Zoe, jij zegt een zonde van het geld. Ik wil graag dat geld ergens anders aan kunnen besteden. Je hebt gehoord dat Timo zei, we kunnen vragen of mensen betalen voor een suikerspin. En op die manier het geld terugverdienen. Is daarmee jouw bezwaar opgeheven? En dan is de motie consent op deze manier. Hartstikke goed.
So yeah, this gives you an idea how a school circle can work with sociocracy. Oops. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. So that school called De Valle PO, it's a primary school, and it's actually another example of state democratic school as well. So in the film, we film 6 schools, 5 of them are private schools. One of them is the state school that you just saw. Here is a picture of the Children's Parliament in India, just to give another context, another example, because in the film, we are aware that you see a lot of white kids in a country, in a European country. So just to also point out that it can work in any kind of situation, any country. So here's a more diverse context. So the process is basically organized in 3 steps. The first one is the picture forming process. It's when we identify the elements of the issue. So if we have a problem, if we have a conflict, any kind of issue can be brought to the picture forming. In the Children's Parliament in India, for example, they already address very hard topics such as alcoholism in their families. So there is a film called Power to the Children that we really recommend. It's on Vimeo. And you can see kids talking about alcoholism in their families, or rubbish in their communities, problems with electricity in their communities, anything you can bring to the circle. And then we have a process of proposal shaping. So we generate ideas, and then we have to tune a proposal based on what we heard from the group. And then the third step is the consent itself, and it's usually organized in 3 rounds: questions, opinions, and consent. So what you saw in the film just now was like a summary of these 3 rounds, because they already had a proposal. So instead of bringing an issue, they brought a proposal, which was having a candy floss machine in the party. So then we had questions, then opinions, and then the consent round. So that's basically how the process works. It can be quite simple, actually.
In practice, it's often very dynamic, because you might get to the consent round and you have some opinions that mean you have to go back and change the proposal. So you have this sort of feedback of updating the proposal, and then you have a final round of consent until you give consent. Or sometimes a proposal gets scrapped because it's just not working out.
Yeah. So as Charlie mentioned in the definition of sociocracy, we work as companions, and that's why we usually say that the circles should have a maximum of 30 people each, so you can hear everyone in a round. So the rounds are very important in sociocracy, so we make sure that everyone has their turn to speak and everyone else can be quiet and listen to everyone at a turn. But when we have big groups, then we have to maybe do popcorn and just ask people to raise their hands, and then we listen, maybe not to everyone. So in the video, you saw that the kids were raising their hands. It was a bit of a chaotic process. They were not following rounds very well there.
Yeah, just wanted to mention, to relate back to one of our original motivations, which was to find examples that overcome this punishment and overcome punitive justice. We found that all of the schools that practice sociocracy that we filmed also practiced conflict mediation. So they had a special circle called the Middelingskring, which is their way of resolving conflict without punishment. And we found this really inspiring, because we noticed that all these schools have very little bullying and very little like bad feelings between the kids, because they had this structure that enabled the kids to resolve conflicts with each other. And also in these schools, they encourage the kids to try and resolve the conflicts with a dialogue before taking it to the circle. But the circle was there as a way to support and say, look, if you can't resolve a conflict, if you're feeling hurt or confused, or someone did something bad to you, take it here and we can mediate it. And another beautiful thing is they often have a student who has gone through the process, who is the one that is actually facilitating the process. So they usually have a few students, maybe a teacher present to help mediate this process. And what is beautiful is that everyone has to give their consent at the end. So that includes the person who is maybe the aggressor, or the person who has hurt someone else, actually has to give their consent to the final decision. So it's not just a mindless punishment. They have to have a dialogue and see how can they actually resolve this problem in a way that feels good to everybody. The last thing I want to mention is that some schools integrate non-violent communication into this process. So NVC and sociocracy really work well together in a conflict mediation setting. So in non-violent communication, you bring in a language of needs and feelings and observations. So they identify the issue, which can be observing what actually happened. They hear the story from each other, and they try and understand, like, how did you feel in this situation, and what might be the needs underlying it. So once they have this picture of what was really the issue, what are the feelings and needs, then they can start to generate proposals, and they create a strategy to resolve this. So this language is both nonviolent communication and sociocracy combined, and then they can give a consent that everyone is happy with at the end. So yeah, just moving on to the circle structure. So in sociocracy, as we said, the second main principle is the circle. So it's a group of people who make consent decisions and work together. And this group of people come around a domain and an aim. So they define the specific area of responsibility and activity. So this limits their domain of authority. So we sometimes say that each circle is semi-autonomous. So it's autonomous to make a decision within its area of responsibility. And the larger circles of the organization have a larger area of responsibility. So that will make a little bit more sense in a minute. And there's the aim, of course, which is what the circle actually does or produces. And each circle has rounds. So that means each person gets a chance to speak, and we're not missing anybody out. So every voice matters. And there are 4 fundamental roles in each circle. Every organization can come up with other roles, and Children's Parliament's a great example. They have like 20 different roles or more they can generate. But these roles, the facilitator is the one who actually leads the process. So they make sure the decision-making process continues. And then we have an administrator who keeps notes, an operational leader, and a representative. And these two, the leader and the representative, are what create the links between the circles. So that creates the organizational structure.
Yeah, we just talking a little bit more about the circle now, because we're gonna show you a few examples of circle structures of schools to illustrate how a whole organization could look like.
I just wanted to mention as well, to relate to the, so in here, this in a democratic school, this would be adults and children taking these roles. So as a way to distribute responsibility for the young people as well, to be a fundamental part of the structure of the school.
Yeah, these 4 roles, they are the 4 sociocratic roles, but of course, in an organization, a school, you still have the operational roles, like being a teacher or being the head teacher. Some democratic schools don't have head teachers, but some do. But anyways, you have, of course, the operational roles as well.
Yeah, so just quickly on the structure. So this is when you start linking the circles together. So each circle has its area of responsibility, and the double link connects them. So on this example, this is kind of like a traditional hierarchy organizational map. So you have like the CEO at the top and the other departments coming down. So the gray arrows going down would show the traditional top-down power. And what the double link does is it brings this bottom-up power. So then you create this feedback loop of power. So you have a closed system now. It's not just a one-directional flow of power.
Yeah, so the operational leader is going from the top down, is doing the top-down movement. So the operational leader participates in both circles here, and the representative is elected from the bottom up. So they go to the higher circle, higher in the sense of higher domain of responsibility.
This is just one way of visualizing it. Another way is like this with the triangles. So Gerard Endenberg liked to visualize it like this, and the little lines are the double links. And this shows that the larger triangles have a larger area of responsibility, because they like to see that there is not a hierarchy of people, but there is a hierarchy of aims. So the higher circles have this larger area of responsibility, but the people change because the people who take the roles are elected on a regular basis. This is another way of visualizing it. This could be called a holarchy. So you see nested circles, like circles within circles, to see like the larger circle has a larger area of responsibility. And the last way is we usually visualize a bit more like this. So you have like circles connected and radiating out, because it kind of overcomes a little bit of this idea of having a kind of a top-down traditional hierarchy view. But it shows that the power kind of radiates out, or the area of responsibility is kind of from the center outwards. So that's how we're going to show you some examples in this way.
Yeah, we're reaching the end of our presentation. I know it's a bit long. I'm sorry for taking so much of the time, but soon we're gonna go to the questions. So we're gonna show you first circle structure, which is present in the film. It's gonna get clearer, but this is how the school circle looks in this school called De Vrijruimte. So you already watched the video of school circle in De Valley PO, and you can see loads of kids and just one adult. That was their school circle, but in this school, the school circle looks like this. They have a representative from the parents, from two people from the staff circle, two people from the teacher circle, two students. So they have representatives from sub-circles joining this. Yeah, the head teacher is here. So she's doing the operational leader role from the board to the school circle. So this is a very different structure. So this is better to visualize. So we have the school circle here in the middle. And as I just said, we have two representatives from the students, two from the teachers, two from the support staff, and two from the parents. And these people come together here. So you only have 8 people in the school circle. And they also have little smaller circles for the students. So they divided them by age, just because they realized that some topics the kids don't feel comfortable talking about with older kids or with younger kids. So they realized that having the age groups can help. So they have smaller groups, then they have the student circle, the support staff circle. It's broken down into admin, communication, finance, and facilities. And also the students can take part of this circle. So this is one example. It's quite clear. And what we like about this school is that every circle, it's kind of compulsory. They expect everyone to participate, and that makes sure that all the decisions are communicated, everyone knows what's happening. So it's very different from the next structure that we're going to show to you.
I just want to say quickly that this structure genuinely overcomes the problem of authoritarian decision making. So this is a democratic structure. So the decisions really are made like this. So the students have the power to make a decision that affects all the students. And the school circle makes the final decisions about anything to do with the whole school. So it's a collective decision, and it really does work.
Yeah, in the film, we show an example of decision making, which was about the school hours. So they were trying to decide what time the school opens and closes, and all the sub-circles talked about it. So the students talked about it, the teachers, the staff, the parents, everyone talked about it in their circles. And then they came together in the school circle to share what each group thought about it. And then they made the decision together in the school circle. And then the second example is the one that you saw in the film. So you have a big and open school circle, which is optional. So people just join if they want to, and to talk about the topics they want to. And the structure looks a bit more like this, and they don't have the double link. So they have a big school circle open to everyone. And then they have the educator circle. They have the admin circle, and some educators are here. Some admins come to the school circle, some educators come to the school circle. And they have the little committees, can be like the gardening, the communication, the study circle, animals, laboratory, the conflict mediation circle that Charlie mentioned, cleaning circle. So these are more operational circles. And they might have an operational leader, but they don't have formal double links. And then they might have the mentoring circles between the mentor, the student, and occasionally the parents. So this is just like a more of a triangle, really, to talk about the learning process of each student. So this is another way of visualizing a circle structure as well. And notice that the board here is more connected to the admin circle, while here the board was connected to the school circle. So the head teacher is the operational leader making this connection, and they actually have a student going to the board as well. So this was interesting in that school.
Yeah, so the board is just the group that has the legal responsibility. So if they have to sign any legal papers and things like that.
And then the last example that we want to show you, it's maybe what is more suitable for a state traditional school. So in the case of the school I worked at, it was very similar structure to this, apart from the double link and the use of sociocracy, but the structure was similar. So you can have the classrooms here, and then each classroom has their circle, and then each classroom can elect a student to go to the student council. And then the student council can elect the students to go to the school council. And there you have the supporting staff, the parents, the teachers. So it's similar to the first one, but a bit more adapted. And in the school council, you can have community members and experts as well joining. In Brazil, every state school has to have a school council. So democratic governance is actually a duty, is actually an obligation in the state schools here. And they propose this ratio, having 30% of teachers, 5% of specialists, 5% of staff, 25% of parents, 25% of students. So you can actually have more than just 2 people elected, you can have many more. That's just another example to illustrate what's possible.
Just unfortunately, in practice, not all the schools really put it into practice as democratic approach.
All right, so we're coming to the end of our presentation. So just would like to show with you a couple of maps.
So this is just a quick map that we're putting together of sociocratic schools. So we started our journey in the Netherlands and we identified a few. And since then, we've been trying to map all the schools in the world that practice sociocracy. And we're doing okay so far, but we need more help. So if you find any sociocratic schools, please let us know and we can add them here. So you can see there's a lot based in Europe, a few in the US, and we don't have many in Asia yet. So if you find any, please let us know.
Or if you start one as well, let us know.
Yeah, we mentioned already the Children's Parliament in India, and we have the different color coding here. So most of the schools we would say are democratic schools, as we mentioned before, but some of them are not. So maybe they just use sociocracy with the staff. So we've put that in a different color there. And just to connect that with the next map, so this one is democratic schools around the world. So this is much bigger, it's a much bigger movement. Most democratic schools use majority rule decision making. A few of them use consensus, and some of them use sociocracy. So all the democratic schools over here that are sociocratic would also be here. So there's a bit of crossover there. And it's a growing movement. There's more and more schools added to this.
This is not our map, by the way. This is by Aero.
Yeah, this one is by Aero. And there's a few resources here. So there's the Democratic Education conferences. And the first one here, AppDec, is for Asia and Pacific zones. So if you're curious to get to know democratic schooling around Asia, definitely check out AppDec, see when the next AppDec is and where it is. And yeah, here's just the last page of some resources. So you can go to our website, wonderingschool.org, and you can find some of our resources there, including our course, Sociocracy for Schools course, that we do a few times a year, and our School Circles film website. And here is a few references of the slides that we did today. So some things on democratic school and sociocracy. So yeah, you can explore those, take a screenshot. We can share our slides and yeah, dive into those resources.
Yeah, we reached the end of our presentation. Hope you enjoyed. And now we pass to you, Justin.
Thank you so much, Charlie and Marianne. I'm so glad you came to chat with us, because when I watched the film, and the conflict mediation part was clearly there, but I hadn't realized that you had featured that specifically because other democratic schools were dishing out the punishments and reproducing the power structures. So I was very glad that you came and highlighted that to us. I have tons of questions, but I would like to open it up to the audience. Some of them have watched the film, some of them have not. And I think I would encourage you to watch it, because sometimes the concepts are quite abstract, and seeing it in practice gives you a real feel of how it's actually done. Does anybody have anything they want to ask to kick us off? Also, beyond social services, and some of them are here with us, they're on this kind of transformational journey and considering sociocracy, and so they've also kindly invited me to join in some of the training sessions they have, and so I'm learning some of the principles and the circle process and consent, and that's been quite enlightening to. Well, I've read about sociocracy, and I couldn't wrap my head around it. I watched your film, then I got a feel of it, and then I practice it, and now I feel that I have a better sense of how to do this, and so that's really nice. And maybe and when they found out that you guys were coming to chat with us, some of them turned up and say, "Please sign us up." Hi, Kenneth.
Hi, thanks for sharing. I have not watched the film yet, but after this, I think I will definitely want to. Once again, have a lot of questions, but thank you for sharing. I was considering like the dynamics. I think there's this component where it requires a bit of intuition for the facilitators to navigate the spaces, especially when it comes to disagreements, or I think when it crosses certain lines that, entire group believes that this is the way for. Like, I mean, I was just looking at the students navigating like what kind of suites they're going to get. And I was wondering to myself, if we were to do it in Singapore, how many of them will really say, 2 suites is too much, right? And at what point do you draw the line, from there? So maybe I'll frame my question this way. Have there been scenarios where sociocracy hasn't worked? And if you could give us an example of that, and why, these are some potential blind spots we can look out for.
Yeah, good question. I could start.
Okay.
So yeah, you made a good observation that there is kind of you need good skills to be a good facilitator, and it's more of an art than a science. So sociocracy does have like the step-by-step process, but in practice it can be quite challenging, because we are dealing with human behavior at the end, and human preferences, especially with young people. And you can often find yourself, it's difficult to resolve objections in practice. And there are many different ways to try and resolve different objections. But at the end, it's not always very easy to come to a resolution. But I would say that there is kind of some sort of magic in the process as well. When people get into practicing it, 99% of the time there is a kind of a solution that sort of pops up. You're like, oh wow, there is a wisdom in the crowd. And I'm trying to think of like a specific example of failures.
With the process, we haven't seen any failures, but in the sociocracy groups we participate, I already seen people commenting that they didn't manage to get to a consent decision. So sometimes some people persist with an objection, and then there's no way to get a consent. And then in some cases they ended up using majority rule to make a decision, but they at least came to the consent decision that they would use majority rule to solve that tension. So you can get to that way around as well. You can decide to use majority rule at the end if you don't manage to get a consent. This can be one way around. And then in one of the schools, what happened, it wasn't a case of failure sociocracy, because they actually didn't even, there was just a point about gaming. One of the schools, a lot of the students were gaming and they couldn't stop, and they spent the whole day gaming. And then the board of directors, they, in their view, they had the duty to intervene due to the health of the students. So they actually forbid gaming in the school, and they didn't make a sociocratic decision around that. They just said, you know what, gaming is forbidden from now on, because they realized that it was such a big issue. And then after some, I think it was after 2 months of gaming being forbidden, they invited the students to come out with a new proposal that could work for gaming to go back to the school, but in a different way, with more rules and regulations. So there was a case of authoritarian intervention to deal with a problem that they were also struggling to solve with sociocracy. So this is one example that comes to mind. But as Charlie said, usually when you start practicing, you find ways around it. Although it does take a bit of time for people to realize what is the area of objection, what is the area of preference, because sometimes I'm too stuck to my preference and I want that to be my way. But once we start to let go a bit and pay more attention really to our body, and realize, oh, this is not coming just from the mind and I want to counter argument. No. I don't actually have any tensions in my body. I can live with that. It's not too bad. Okay, then we start to work together really and overcome these differences. So does that make sense, Kenneth?
Yeah, thanks. I think you're pointing out the aspect of like preference versus tolerance and objection. And I thought that language was quite wonderful. And of course, I think it also retains the fact that like the character of the leaders are very important as well, in order to determine like whether to issue something a lot more authoritative, you know, instead of sociocratic or sociocratic later in that sense. So thank you so much for replying to
that. Maybe to help the parents in the room ask questions, because many of them will not want to admit that they are tiger mothers or fathers. So Singaporean parents are sometimes overly competitive, right? And there's this idea that, you know, you have to force your kids to try something. If you give them too much freedom, they'll end up playing video games and, you know, wasting their time. What would you say to parents who don't trust that their kids will make the right decisions? If you gave them freedom to decide on their education, and sometimes parents force their kids to do something, and sometimes it turns out badly. You know, you learn violin, and if not, and then you get traumatized by the harsh regime of piano or violin learning, and you kind of never ever want to do it again. But then sometimes the parents force you and you learn piano and you hate it, but you end up being quite good at it, and because you get quite good at it, you learn how to enjoy it later. But do you have any kind of wisdom to share on these kind of dilemmas?
Yeah, sure. I think when parents start feeling scared of giving voice or listening to their kids more, giving more power to their kids, I would say, don't forget that you're also in the circle, parent. You're also there. So you also have your voice. So when we do the circle with the kids, it's the parents and the kids. And then everyone has to give their consent, the child and the adult. So if you feel there is something being proposed there by the child that is not safe enough, is not good enough, then you give your objection as well. And that's okay, because we're trying to make agreements that work for everyone. So of course, that would also mean that you have to also live with your stretch zone and be a bit more flexible to adapt. But you can also be firm and set your limits and your boundaries. So I think that gives a bit more relief to the parents to know that they can also be heard and respected, and they also have a voice in the decision-making process. Yeah.
I just want to add to that is there's sometimes this confusion between freedom and license. So when you give license to a kid to just do whatever they want, then that's not truly freedom, because freedom needs some boundaries and some rules to be able to navigate and to be able to grow. So I think it's this tricky question of like, at what point is it just letting them do whatever they want, and at what point is it helping them to grow? So I don't think there's any one clear answer to that, but it's like a continual question.
Yeah, I just also want to add that not every democratic school allows gaming, for example. So the Sudbury approach that we mentioned is basically like that. The kids can do whatever they want with the time, and they offer some classes like math or English or history that the kids can join or not. But some other democratic schools have very different approaches, and they don't allow video gaming at all. And the kids have to be working on their projects, and they have to be going to tutoring. They can still organize their schedule. They can decide a lot about how and when they learn, but there are more restrict rules as well about what they can do in that space. And that's also okay. So each school will have their own approach, and they would set their own boundaries, sometimes by the founders from the beginning, sometimes with the kids. And so we also see a lot of diversity and where the boundaries are, you know, what is allowed, what's not allowed.
Sui has a question. Sui, would you like to ask your question, and I'll get to Helen in the chat later?
Sure. Thanks, Justin, and thanks, Charlie and Marion, for sharing your experience and insights. My question is around when we first introduced sociocracy to an organization and looking at the transition. So can you share your experience or insights around how to support the training and the implementation to lessen the pains of transition? Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually a slightly different answer depending on the type of organization as well. So let's say if it's a very small private school that is just kind of at the beginning of its foundational process, that's going to have a slightly different approach to the implementation to, let's say, like an established state school or established organization. So it's certainly easier with a tiny school that's starting from scratch. So you might like work with the head teacher and a small core team to kind of go through some training and then to start creating the first circles. And one of the first things we might implement is speaking in rounds. So this can really change the dynamic of a decision. So no matter what the type of organization, if you try and put this idea of speaking in rounds, you start to say to the culture, it's important to listen to everybody. So even just that one shift can be a kind of a key to start unlocking this idea of collective decision-making or collective listening. So yeah, I would say like the rounds is kind of like the first approach to transitioning. And then the next step is to then put in a consent decision. So once you are listening to everyone, then we can say, okay, so now we're at a point where we have to make a decision. You have a choice. Do we do a vote, or do we just listen to the boss, or do we see if we can get a consent from everyone?
Yeah, and for that you need to have a facilitator as well. But I would say that no matter what the structure is, just start with what you have, you know. So everyone already does meetings, so you probably already participate in some sort of meeting. And usually, I don't know, I had very bad experiences with meetings. It's everyone talking on top of each other and no one listens to anyone. It's such a mess and it takes ages. So you can be the first person to say, well, why don't we try rounds, as Charlie said. And that makes the whole difference. Once you start listening to everyone in rounds, it goes like, whoa, what is happening? People actually can be heard and have a voice. And what is beautiful is that sometimes you hear two people in rounds, and then when it comes to you, you feel like, oh, everyone said what I wanted to say already. I can be silent. Oh, okay, I'll just pass my turn. It's magical when this happens. And I think there's a good start. And even, for example, with a big traditional school, as I said, at least in Brazil, but I'm pretty sure in other countries as well, you already have a school circle, a school council. State schools have a school council, but it's just not effective. So why don't we start there to implement in the existing structure that we have? We can just start bringing elements of it. And as Charlie said, okay, use rounds. And for that, you're going to need to elect a facilitator. So I would say the first two things is elections. Elect at least a facilitator to make sure that the process works, and then you have rounds. And then, yeah, use rounds is a good transition. And then if you can do a sociocratic election, that's even better. So just to learn how the sociocratic election works, to make sure that you can elect someone sociocratically. But even if not, even if you just start with someone jumping in and say, okay, I can facilitate, that's okay. That's a good start.
Thank you so much.
Does that make sense? Okay.
Helen, are you there? Can I invite people who are around and feel comfortable to switch on your video so that we can see your faces and see how you're responding to it? Helen has a question, and I wondered if it is because you're thinking of maybe to share a bit of your context. You're asking how might a circle work if there's a mix of children with special needs together with typical children. Helen, do you want to give us some context on where you work and why you're asking this question?
Oh, that's because we have children with we're serving children with special needs as well. So I'm just wondering, because if we were to put children with special needs together with typically developing children, so one of the challenges could be that they function differently. So I mean, it would be great if all of them have equal voices to contribute and all of them are heard. It's just that it could be hard when some of the children are yelling and screaming and then the other children are behaving differently. So I'm just wondering, from your experience, how might a circle in that kind of situation work out? So yeah, I am keen to share the concept with my colleagues who are working with children with special needs to see how we could facilitate some of these things. Yeah, I'm just wondering pragmatically how that might work.
That's a great question. Thanks, Helen. I think there's not really one easy answer to that, but at least in some situations, if you can have an assistant with the kids with special needs, that can be either an adult trained assistant or a student who has experience, and they can be sitting next to the students or students with special needs as a way to either give them comfort or give them a voice, or to help clarify things to them, or to help them speak their ideas. And I think it's really important to give time to them as well. So it's really important to say that everybody's important in the circle, and if someone needs extra support, then they need extra support from another person who's specifically got that role to help them. Would you anything?
Yeah, sometimes if having an assistant is not practical, at least, yes, Charlie said, having a student, maybe, you know, someone would volunteer to support the other student with special needs in the circle, just to make sure that everyone is heard. A good tool to use with kids is a talking stick. So you can have a talking stick moving around, and then only the person holding the stick can speak, and then you just make sure that everyone can be heard. We really like using talking sticks with kids. It's really fun.
And, another tool that works with some kids is having something practical to kind of play with or hold. Like if they're really agitated and they're kind of fidgeting around a lot, if you just have like some colorful dough or some puzzles or something to kind of keep them a little bit occupied with their body, that can also help to kind of reduce some agitation as well. It only works with some kids, of course.
Yeah, I think these are the tips that I have to give as well. Does that make sense, Helen? Would you consider this?
Yeah, I mean, I would share these ideas with my colleagues and see how we could try some of these things. Yeah, probably we need to take that first step before we know, I mean, how things would turn out.
Yeah, let us know if you can.
Yeah.
If you can, let us know how that went. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, we'd love to brainstorm ideas as well, how to bring more people in, no matter what their needs are.
Yeah, Justin, is it okay if we put our contacts in the chat?
Yes, of course. Please do.
Okay.
And Adila from Mendaki just popped up, and maybe she has questions. Mendaki does a lot of. No, you don't want to.
Yeah, everything is good. Thanks so much for the sharing.
If you don't mind, maybe you could share what I'm curious with the audience in the room, having heard about democratic education, sociocracy, whether what parts of it you thought was interesting to you, or maybe your work in your organization.
I think recently, especially post-COVID, there's been more awareness and more concern in terms of the mental well-being of our students. And while the majority of what we do in Mendaki, at least for me, when it comes to students, is we provide academic support intervention, we're finding increasingly that the role of our tutors extends beyond just academic support, to also look into how we can discuss certain issues or certain challenges that the students are going through. So, I mean, one of the ways that we thought we could implement the circles is as a way to check in with the students in terms of how they're doing for the day. And even like beyond that, when the tutors come together to discuss, you know, how the classes have been going and to share common issues, or and we have many facilitated engagement sessions with various stakeholders that involves like maybe our tutors, our school teachers, even school personnel and other key stakeholders, even parents. So I mean, the formats and the ideas that were shared have been really useful, have given us some good ideas for us to take back.
Thank you so much, Adila.
Most welcome.
I wonder if your counterpart in the CDAC, Teo Shui, are you there? Do you have, if you're there, would you mind sharing something? If not, that's okay too. Does anybody else have other questions? Hi, Ansu. Ansu has been instrumental in supporting Beyond in this kind of sociocracy transformation form, and he's kind of like led the charge, and also in nonviolent communication. I missed that training, but you know, I wished I was there. Hi, please, Ansu.
Yeah, no, hi, Charlie, Marin. First of all, thank you so much for making the film. I mean, it's such a beautiful film, and I've been interested in sociocracy for 2 years now, and I find the film is such a useful way to show people and get them excited about it. At the beginning of your film, you had some text that said that not all the participants in the film would agree with the views represented in the film. So I was wondering if you could speak to like what some of the more nuanced views that were not included in the film were.
Cool, I love that question. I'll have to think back now. Let's see. Well, there was a few.
I know an example. Yeah. So, for example, when we showed the film, we had a premiere in the Netherlands, and we showed the film to people from all the schools, right? And then at the end of the film, someone from one school came to us and said, I don't like the way they do their school meetings just with the representatives, because they thought that that circle structure wasn't that inclusive, because it wasn't open to everyone to participate. It was just the representatives from the different subcircles. So they were complaining about the other school. Like, I can't believe they do it like this. This is not a democratic school approach, you know. So when we shared the film with the schools, we noticed that they were commenting like, oh, but they put this together with them here and it wasn't related. Anyway, so it's just when we are editing, we had to make executive decisions and, you know, how to put things together. And then when the schools watched, they felt maybe not really represented. And I think it was based on their feedback that we added that to the film, just to make sure that we're saying they don't agree with each other completely. You know, some of them, they have different pedagogical approaches as well. So we just didn't want to put them all together in a box. Although they are very similar, we thought they are so similar, but sometimes they don't see the similarities.
Yeah, there's a funny thing when you get into tiny niches, little corners of alternative schooling, is there's this whole political landscape, right? From an outsider, you might think, wow, they're exactly the same. But when you're actually in there, you realize that there's just this one difference that kind of splits them apart. They say, no, we're a different school now. So one of the schools we stayed with actually split out from another school very close by because they had quite a big disagreement. So that actually relates to the thing about the sociocracy failing, actually, is that underlying is also the philosophy, right? The vision, the belief, the philosophy. So the sociocracy is on top of that. It's the decision-making platform, but underneath that is the fundamental worldview, isn't it? The fundamental philosophy. So if you notice that there's a split in the way you want to do your pedagogy, then that's going to be very difficult to resolve through a decision-making process, because underlying it is actually we want to do school differently.
Yes, so for example, Do, which is the school where they had the gaming episode. So the head teacher stepped in and said, no gaming for 2 months. That generated so much conflict in the school. That was one of the main episodes that made the school split. And then Loss, one of the schools in the film, was created because some parents and educators got really unhappy with that approach. Like, we don't want the head teacher to step in and say no gaming. So then they created another school. And also De Valepio, which is the only state-funded school. They were also a private school before, but they believed that schools should be public, should be state. So they went for the state funding, which is a right that every private school in the Netherlands can follow. So every private school there can apply for state funding, but they have to start following some regulations. So they have to reach 200 students, they have to go to the national examinations, and the Valepio chose to go that route just so they were free of charge. They were free to all the kids. And then some of the other schools say, I would never let go of my ideals. I would never let go of this and this to be state funded. So they also critical of the state funded school because they had to let go of some freedoms that they have.
One example is that the private schools, pretty much all of them wanted the full age mixing, all the way from tiny kids, like 3 or 4 years old, up until 18 or beyond. The state school could not have kids older than 13, for example. So they had to fit within that box.
Yeah, so a bunch of little things like that. They ended up separating the schools, and we were trying to unite them more and say, like, look, you're so similar, you have so much to share and learn with each other. But it's funny that sometimes they don't see this similarity.
That's quite fascinating, like educational sectarianism, even in the democratic movement. I want to kind of tag along a question, and there Kiat Lim and Jong Han asked in the chat. Having seen different models, so you shared 3 models of school circles, I wonder, do you have a sense of the kind of trade-offs that come from such models? For example, having a large school circle where everyone can come versus ones that have representatives, and whether there are other trade-offs that these school circle structures tend to have to try to think about and balance. And do you think there's an ideal circle structure, or do you think that the circle structures always have to fit the circumstances and context?
Oh, there's no perfect circle structure, that's for sure.
I think my favorites is diversity. I think the most important thing in education is diversity of approaches. I don't think there's one answer to a circle structure or pedagogy at all. I think diversity is the most important thing in the education system. And in terms of the circle structure, we noticed that the schools that are just like open to anybody, depending on whatever their interest is, compared to the more formalized double link and circle structure, I think there's definitely an improvement in communication when you have the double links. So everybody is present, everybody is linked, so the communication flows more clearly. And if you have like a certain proposal for a certain area in the school, but that needs to be then taken to like a higher circle, there's more of a clear process, like, okay, the representative then goes here and is representing this circle. When you don't have that, it's a bit more of a mess and the communication is not always as clear.
Yeah, both have their pros and cons. So what a lot of democratic schools like, even the ones that don't use sociocracy, is to have the big open school circle, because that gives a sense of community. It's a moment for everyone to come together and build that community. So that is actually a very fundamental part of the democratic school. So when they saw the little school circle only with 8 people, all the representatives, they felt like this is not democratic, because we like to have the whole community there. But that school, they were saying like, we cannot have 200 people in a circle and make sure that everyone is heard. So they realized that you need the smaller circles to be able to make sure that everyone is heard, that the communication flows, as Charlie said. So they prioritize that. And sometimes even there's another critical point, which is deciding if the school circle is compulsory or optional. That makes the whole difference, because sometimes we visited a democratic school that uses majority rule. It doesn't matter if they use sociocracy majority rule, but if the participation is compulsory, then you make sure that everyone knows what was decided and everyone was there participating with consent or majority rule, doesn't matter, but you make sure that everyone is on the same boat. And when you have it optional, then you have the chance of a decision not being well communicated, or someone wasn't present and they, like for example, with the gaming, one of the schools as well, the one student said, I want gaming to be forbidden. And then the gamers were not present. And then the decision was the game was forbidden from now on. And then the gamers heard of the decision and said, no. And then they brought the topic again. And then again, they have to decide on the same thing. So when you have it optional, you have the risk of decisions having to be made over and over again.
But if you have it compulsory, you might get resistance from
and
kids,
boredom. So they
kids that don't want to be there, make it clear that they don't want to be there, and they're kind of fidgeting and distracting and
disrupting the process. So there's no perfect solution. We've seen actually this topic of making the school circle optional or compulsory, we've seen that topic being taken to school circles in many schools. And some of them decided to be compulsory and then they changed to optional or vice versa. They're trying it out and figuring out what works best for them. And then with the circle structure, it's the same thing. There's no perfect circle structure, but at least we subscribe to the idea of having a good communication system. That's important. So you need to make sure that decisions are well communicated. If it's in an online platform, if it's on a board, if it's through a representative, just to make sure that everyone knows what's happening. This is the most important thing.
That's so fascinating. So the compulsory or optional circle participation is kind of a design feature of the circle structure that a lot of schools think about. Are there other key design features that they deliberate a lot about? Size, like you mentioned, 30 to you that's the maximum. Is size one of the?
Yeah.
I'm curious about other features.
Size is definitely a feature. So that's related to the circle, like the optional circle, right? That circle can get massive. So if you have a school of 200 kids and it's a topic that the whole school is interested in, then you will have most of the school trying to cram into a small space. So it can be huge, and then you just cannot do sociocracy in that situation. It just doesn't function.
And sometimes they don't even have the space to gather 200 people. So they don't have the room that fits 200 people. So that's also.
So if you have a really big group, you have to adapt. You can't do rounds anymore. You just have to have a few people shouting out. So then you're back to the kind of old way of doing things.
Yeah.
So there's really like a sweet spot of my personal opinion would be between about 4 and 8 people as a kind of like a sweet spot for making like really good, rich decisions. But you can go all the way up to sort of 20,
30 is the
30. But when you have a big group like that, you have to start adapting the process.
I'm curious also.
Go ahead. So both Gerard Endenberg, he came out with the number of 30, and then the Children's Parliament in India, they also came out with the number of 30 as the maximum number of people in a group to be able to use rounds and hear to everyone. And even with 30, you have to try to go very quick. So yeah, that's even with 30 is a bit challenging. But once you get the rhythm of the process, you can do it with the amount easily.
I'm also curious about the double links. There are some circles that may not have double links and some have. So what do you think your view is on if there are no representatives that are elected that go into the main circles? What's the trade-off there?
There's a few trade-offs. I think one of them is when you do have double linking, you have the pro of accountability. So there's 2 people that are representing the different circles. So it means it's not just one person that has the potential to be more corruptible or not quite remember something well or to transfer information a little bit different. So the 2 people kind of a check and balance for each other. Another one is that when you don't have a double link, then you don't have a clear structure that can be expanded upon. Well, so this double link creates a sort of fractal pattern, as we mentioned. So you can create a very complex system, but it all makes sense and the communication is all connected when you have the double link. If you don't have the double link, your complexity is limited to a simple structure because the communication just is not clear.
Yes, sometimes not having someone responsible makes the whole difference as well, because sometimes like, oh, but who should communicate that to the group? And it's like, well, I don't know who. And then if you don't have a clear responsible to make that communication, sometimes that can be a challenge. Yeah.
Another interesting thing is a lot of alternative democratic schools do have a culture of this kind of like laid back family vibe, and there's quite a resistance to anything bureaucratic or structural. So that's also why people don't like to necessarily add like double links and extra layers of bureaucracy. They like a bit of mess and they like the sort of family vibe.
They like mess, but yeah, they like feeling like a family rather than organization.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Kiat Lim has a question about, are there examples where, because we talked about sociocracy in schools and maybe in nonprofits, are there sociocracy in business or for-profit organizations beside Gerard Endenberg's own company? And did it make a lot of money? Was it successful?
Yeah, so it's actually much more common in businesses outside of schools. So it took some time to really kind of come back into schools and start growing. So the sociocracy in schools, most of the sociocracy schools are very new, like just in the last 5 years or so, like probably
13 years is the oldest, isn't it?
Yeah, on our map, 13 years old is the oldest school. So they're all newer than that, basically.
And the organizations, as Charlie said, it's much more common. I just shared in the chat the Sociocracy for All website, and there you can find loads of organizations practicing sociocracy. There's a lot of non-profit, for-profit, co-ops, everything, co-housings. There's loads of organizations there they can explore. They did a lot of case studies, so yeah, you can find a lot there. Our specialization is in education, it's within schools, but as Charlie said, it's actually more common in organizations that are not schools than in schools. So you can find loads of examples. And Gerard Endenberg company is definitely a successful company.
It's still going today.
Still going, yeah. And in the Netherlands, they have a legal entity for sociocracy. So you can register your organization as a sociocratic organization. I think it's the only country that has that as a legal structure. And it means that the organization owns itself. You don't have the owner of the company. So Gerard is not the owner of Endenberg's Electrics anymore. Once he opted for implementing sociocracy, he let go of the power and said, no, this doesn't belong to me. This belongs to itself. No one is the owner of the organization. So it's quite a radical shift, really.
An interesting sort of perspective on that is that companies are usually like created as like legal people in a way. They're kind of like a ghost person, a normal company. In that perspective, the company is a slave to its shareholders. So it's owned by the shareholders, whereas a sociocratic organization owns itself. So there's no, it doesn't, it's kind of a hard one to get your head around. You need to look at the real details of the legality of how it works. But
yeah, and the director is elected sociocratically every, I don't know, you decide every year, or you decide the regularity of the elections. But for example, when we visited the Sociocratic Centrum in the Netherlands and interviewed Gerard, we also interviewed Anna Vick, and she was the head of the Sociocratic Centrum back then. But then when we released the film, there was another head of the Sociocratic Centrum. They had already elected someone else. So that changes as well. It's really cool.
We're almost out of time, but I really want to ask this final question, which is that I think everyone's thinking this looks great, but what are the results? You know, do these kids do better academically and all that? But that's just the first part of the question. I think the second part, which is more important, is what do you think? Because as the policymakers or funders or the nonprofits here are listening to this and they're thinking about whether they should consider doing some parts of this in Singapore. And it'd be great, you know, if in your map there's, you know, a dot here, a Sociocratic school somewhere here, that would be wonderful. But how would you now advise what should be the monitoring or evaluating framework? Or how should we think about what counts as success? Is grades the thing? Because if we don't say, you know, there are other ways of counting success for sociocracy or democratic education, everyone's going to look at the grades, right? What would you say to what is meaningful to measure in this case?
This is a difficult question. The thing is, as we said, there's a lot of diversity in the pedagogy of the school. So we can talk about the specific schools from the film, or we can talk about democratic schools in general, or I don't know, it's a bit difficult to frame.
Yeah, I would just say that, just to reiterate, so there's a difference between the pedagogy and the governance. So if you're asking about the pedagogy of, say, a free school or a natural learning school, which is what the films were, what the schools were in the film, then you can say one of their aims is the well-being of the students. So you can say clearly from an observational perspective is that the kids have a higher level of well-being on average than kids in the normal traditional school. So that is a main aim of this type of schooling, and they clearly are doing well on that aspect.
In the schools, the democratic schools, we don't see bullying anymore, segregation. Like the students, they all live in a community. They respect each other. They're very autonomous because they learn how to use their time and to look forward for their goals and pursue their goals. So these are usually qualities that developed in democratic schools.
Very common to have a lot of kids who dropped out of the mainstream system because they were suffering from anxiety or depression and many mental health issues. And then they go to one of these democratic or unschooling schools and they feel much better. They feel included and they are able to reconnect with their joy. But then the next question is, what about next? What about developing their sort of academic abilities and their growth? Then in this pedagogy of unschooling, there is a lot of criticism that maybe it doesn't help to push them in their academic areas. And I just want to make this point again, the distinction between the governance and the pedagogy. So this is in this kind of unschooling, natural learning process. But if we're just talking about sociocracy, the governance aspect, or democratic involvement, then you can say the most important point here is that we're involving students in decision making. So that is a clear practice of an ability or several abilities to voice your opinion, to develop arguments, to think about the future, to help to organize a school. So these are all what you could call like leadership qualities that the 21st century is looking for.
Yeah, I just want to also tap into your first question, Justin. So we've seen kids going to all kinds of different areas as well. So there are research being made into what is the next step after these kids leave democratic schools. Where do they go to? And there's plenty of studies that show that they go to different universities, they take different courses. Some of them choose more of an artistic path. To be fair, a lot of democratic schools, they focus a lot on the arts. They have a lot of art resources, and then a lot of students become musicians or artists. And so there's that, but they can also become doctors, lawyers. There's diversity for sure. I guess regarding the pedagogy, what we subscribe to is what we call liberating education. So those 4 pillars for me should be the pillars to be evaluated, which is the autonomy, the dialogue, the problematization or critical thinking, and then the engagement with the world. So in Paulo Freire's approach, the school should be a place for transforming the world, transforming reality, and both in the social emancipation of the students, but also holding hands and helping others in need to also develop themselves. So I would love to see schools that have this concern with social development as well. And the curriculum focus on human rights that we mentioned. So yeah, I would like to end the talk on that note.
Thank you so much, Charlie and Marian. I think whether people here care about the grades or not, we are grappling with huge mental health issues, especially for students. I hear stories of how at the most elite schools, the mental health rates are the worst. So, whether they care about it or not is something we have to grapple with. So thank you so much, Charlie and Marianne, for coming to share with us. And I know it's so late down there in Brazil, and we're very grateful and honored to have you spend this time with us. Thank you, everybody. And we'll get in touch with Charlie and Marianne if you guys want to have further conversations or consult on studying a democratic school or even doing sociocracy. Thank you and goodbye, everybody.